The moment Julian Carter stepped onto Flight 247 at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, he knew something was wrong. It was not the first-class seat itself. He had paid for it. It was not the aircraft. He had flown on this model dozens of times. It was the way the gate agent looked at him when he scanned his boarding pass. A pause, a second glance, a frown that lasted just long enough to communicate something unspoken but unmistakable. Julian was dressed simply, a dark gray hoodie, faded blue jeans, and clean white sneakers that had seen better days. No watch on his wrist, no designer luggage, just a worn brown leather backpack slung over his right shoulder. He looked like a graduate student. He looked like someone who should be sitting in economy class, row 42, middle seat, knees pressed against the tray table. He looked like someone who did not belong in first class. And in that moment, in that split second of silent judgment, the gate agent, Trevor Blake, decided exactly that. Trevor Blake was a man who had worked at O'Hare for 11 years. He had seen thousands of passengers pass through his gate. He prided himself on being able to read people. The wealthy ones, he would say to his colleagues during coffee breaks, you can spot them from 50 feet away. The way they walk, the way they hold their phone, the way they hand you their boarding pass without looking at you. Julian Carter did none of those things. Julian handed Trevor his boarding pass with both hands and a quiet thank you. And Trevor took it with the kind of reluctance a person reserves for something distasteful. He scanned it. The system beeped green. First class, seat 2A, confirmed, paid in full. Trevor stared at the screen for a moment longer than necessary. Then he looked up at Julian, and his expression did not change. "Sir," Trevor said, his voice flat. He did not say it like a question. He said it like a dismissal. Julian nodded and walked toward the jet bridge. He could feel Trevor watching him. He could feel the woman behind him in line watching him too. He could feel the small crowd of waiting passengers, all of them noting the discrepancy between the man and the seat. A man in a hoodie walking into the first-class cabin. It did not add up. And when things do not add up, people stare, they whisper, they record. The jet bridge was cold, the kind of cold that seeps through thin clothing and settles into your bones. Julian walked with his backpack on one shoulder, his boarding pass crumpled slightly in his left hand. His fingers were calloused, years of typing, years of coding, years of building something from nothing. He thought about his daughter Ava. She was 12 now. She had asked him that morning before he left for the airport why he always dressed so simply when he traveled. "Daddy, you own the company," she had said. "You could wear anything." Julian had smiled and told her that a person should be judged by what they build, not by what they wear. Ava had rolled her eyes the way 12-year-olds do, but she had hugged him tight before he walked out the door. That hug was still warm in his chest as he stepped onto the aircraft. The flight attendant at the door was a woman in her mid-40s named Monica Hayes. She had sharp cheekbones, carefully applied red lipstick, and the kind of posture that came from 23 years of service in premium cabins. She greeted the passenger ahead of Julian with a radiant smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Henderson. Right this way. Champagne before takeoff as always." She knew his name. She knew his drink. She knew his preferences because he was the kind of passenger she respected. He looked the part. Then Monica turned to Julian, and the smile did not just disappear. It was replaced by something colder, something that looked almost like offense, as if his presence in the first-class boarding lane was a mistake she was being forced to correct. "Boarding pass, please," she said. Her tone was clipped, professional but impatient. Julian handed it to her. She looked at it. She looked at him. She looked at the boarding pass again. Then she said the words that would change everything. "Seat 2A, is this correct, sir?" "Yes," Julian said. His voice was calm. He had spent 39 years learning to keep his voice calm in moments exactly like this one. Monica did not move aside. She stood in the narrow aisle, blocking his path, holding his boarding pass as if it might be counterfeit. "Sir," she said, lowering her voice just enough to make it clear this was not a conversation for the other passengers to hear. "I need to verify this. Please step to the side." Julian did not step to the side. He stood where he was, his backpack still on his shoulder, his expression unchanged. He had been here before. Not on this aircraft, not with this flight attendant, but in this moment. The moment where someone in uniform decides that a man who looks like him cannot possibly belong in a space he has legally and financially earned the right to occupy. Monica looked past him toward the jet bridge, as if expecting someone else to appear, a real first-class passenger, someone in a suit, someone with a Rolex, someone who looked like the money they spent. When no one appeared, she sighed and gestured toward the cabin. "Follow me." She walked him to seat 2A. It was a wide leather seat next to the window. There was a blanket folded neatly on the armrest, a pillow, a bottle of water. The other first-class passengers were already settled in. A white man in a navy suit, seat 1A, scrolling through emails on his phone. An elderly white woman in 1C, adjusting her silk scarf. A couple in 3A and 3C, both dressed in business attire, reviewing documents together. They all looked up when Julian arrived. They all looked at his hoodie, his jeans, his backpack, his skin, and they all looked away quickly, the way people do when they are embarrassed to be caught staring, but not embarrassed enough to stop. Monica waited until Julian had placed his backpack in the overhead bin. She waited until he had sat down and fastened his seatbelt. Then she leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, I am going to ask you one more time. Is this really your seat?" "Yes," Julian said. He did not raise his voice. He did not look away from her. Monica straightened up. She looked at the other first-class passengers. She looked back at Julian. Then she made her decision. "I am sorry, sir, but I am going to have to ask you to leave the first-class cabin. There appears to be an issue with your booking. We will reseat you in economy once all passengers have boarded." The cabin went silent. The man in 1A stopped scrolling through his emails. The woman in 1C froze with her scarf halfway adjusted.
The couple in 3A and 3C exchanged glances. Everyone was listening. Everyone was watching. Everyone was witnessing, in real time, a man being publicly removed from a seat he had paid for, on an aircraft he was supposed to be traveling on, because a flight attendant had looked at his clothing and his skin and decided he did not belong. Julian did not move. He sat in his seat, seatbelt fastened, hands resting on his knees. He looked up at Monica Hayes, and for the first time, there was something in his eyes that was not calm. It was not anger. It was something deeper, something quieter. It was the look of a man who had spent his entire life being judged by the wrong metrics, and who had promised himself, a long time ago, that he would never again let someone else define his worth. "I paid for this seat," Julian said. His voice was even, slow, each word carefully placed. "You can check the system again. You will see that my booking is valid. My payment cleared. My boarding pass scanned green at the gate. There is no issue with my booking. There is only an issue with your perception." Monica blinked. She was not used to being spoken to this way, not in her cabin, not by a passenger, not by a man who looked like he had just walked in from the street. "Sir," she said, her voice tightening, "I have been doing this job for 23 years. I know how to identify a valid first-class passenger, and I am telling you, you need to leave this cabin now." Then the elderly woman in 1C spoke up for the first time. Her name was Evelyn Brooks. She was 76 years old. She had been flying first class since before Monica Hayes was a flight attendant. She had seen a lot of things in her life. She had seen segregation. She had seen integration. She had seen progress, and she had seen regression. And what she was seeing right now, in this cabin, at 35,000 feet made her deeply uncomfortable. "Excuse me, young lady," Mrs. Brooks said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that only a woman in her 70s can wield. "That man showed you his boarding pass. Your system accepted it at the gate. If there is a problem with his booking, that is your airline's problem, not his. He should not be punished for your mistake." Monica turned to Mrs. Brooks with a practiced smile that did not reach her eyes. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but this is a security and service matter. Please let me handle it." "It does not look like you are handling it," Mrs. Brooks said. "It looks like you are humiliating him." The word hung in the air. Humiliating. It was the right word. It was the only word, and everyone in that cabin knew it. Monica's jaw tightened. She turned back to Julian. "Sir, this is your final warning. Leave this cabin voluntarily, or I will have security escort you off this aircraft entirely." Julian looked at Monica Hayes for a long moment. He looked at the other passengers. He looked at Mrs. Brooks, and he gave her a small nod of gratitude. Then he unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood up. He reached into the overhead bin and pulled down his worn brown leather backpack. He did not argue. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply picked up his bag and walked toward the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the aircraft. But before he stepped through, he turned back. He looked at Monica Hayes one last time, and he said something that no one in the cabin understood. "Not yet. You are right about one thing, Monica. You should be able to identify your passengers. But you missed something." Monica raised an eyebrow. "And what is that?" Julian smiled. It was not a triumphant smile. It was not a bitter smile. It was the smile of a man who knew something that no one else in that cabin knew. Something that would turn this entire situation inside out. "You did not ask who I am." He stepped through the curtain and disappeared into the economy cabin, and behind him, in the first-class cabin, an uncomfortable silence settled over the remaining passengers. Mrs. Brooks stared at the curtain for a long time. The man in 1A returned to his emails, but his fingers were not moving. Something about what just happened did not sit right with anyone. And somewhere, deep in the electronic systems of the aircraft, a boarding manifest sat waiting to be reviewed. A manifest that contained a name. A name that, in approximately 45 minutes, would cause the entire airline to descend into chaos. Julian Carter, founder and CEO of CarterSync, the technology company that held a $240 million contract to overhaul the airline's entire booking, security, and customer experience infrastructure. The contract that was supposed to be signed tomorrow morning. The contract that the airline's Vice President of Operations, Diane Whitmore, had been working to secure for 18 months. The contract that would determine whether the airline's stock price survived the next quarter or plummeted into freefall. Julian Carter had been thrown out of first class by his own future business partner, and he had walked away without revealing his identity. Not because he was weak, not because he was passive, but because he understood something that Monica Hayes, Trevor Blake, and everyone else at that airline did not. The most powerful man on that aircraft was not the one in the suit. He was the one in the hoodie, sitting silently in economy, waiting for the phone calls to begin, waiting for the panic to set in, waiting for the moment when the people who had judged him by his appearance would have to face the reality of who they had just humiliated. And Julian Carter had spent his entire career preparing for moments exactly like this one. He pulled out his phone. He opened his email. He saw the message from Diane Whitmore, sent just 2 hours ago. "Julian, looking forward to having you on board today. We will have a car waiting for you at the arrival gate. Tomorrow's contract signing is going to be a historic day for both of us." Julian typed his reply slowly, each word measured, each word carrying the weight of what was about to happen. "Diane, there has been a change of plans. I am on the flight, but I am no longer in first class. Your staff made sure of that. We need to talk before tomorrow morning, if there is still a tomorrow morning." He pressed send. Then he put his phone away, leaned back in his economy seat, and closed his eyes. 45 minutes. That was all it would take. 45 minutes until the airline learned what happens when you judge a man by his hoodie instead of his history. And somewhere, in the cockpit of Flight 247, the captain received a routine message from air traffic control. It was a clear day, smooth skies ahead, no turbulence expected. The captain did not know that the real turbulence was happening 12 rows behind him in seat 27B, where a quiet man in a gray hoodie was about to become the most important passenger on the entire aircraft. Julian Carter was not supposed to be on Flight 247. He was not supposed to be in Chicago at all. He was supposed to be in San Francisco, in his corner office on the 42nd floor of the Carter Sink headquarters, reviewing the final contract terms with his legal team. But his chief operating officer, Marcus Chen, had called him 3 days ago with a problem that only Julian could solve. A server migration at their Chicago data center had gone wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Just wrong enough that the client was nervous. And when a $240 million contract was on the line, nervous clients needed to be looked in the eye and reassured. So Julian had flown to Chicago. He had spent 2 days in a cold server room, drinking bad coffee, working alongside his engineers to fix the problem. He had not packed a suit. He had not packed his watch. He had packed exactly what he needed to do the work. And now he was flying home, to San Francisco, where his daughter Ava was waiting for him, where the final contract signing was supposed to happen tomorrow morning, where his entire company's future hung in the balance of a single signature. But to understand why Julian Carter's removal from first class was more than just an insult, you have to understand who Julian Carter was before he became the founder and CEO of a $4 billion technology company. You have to understand the 39 years that led him to seat 27B on Flight 247. Julian was born in a small town in southern Alabama called Meridian Cross, population 2,412. His mother, Lena Carter, was a high school math teacher. His father, Samuel Carter, was a mechanic who owned a small auto repair shop on the edge of town. They were not wealthy. They were not poor. They were the kind of family that fixed things themselves because hiring someone else was a luxury they could not afford. Samuel taught Julian how to take apart an engine before he taught him how to ride a bike. Lena taught him algebra at the kitchen table while she graded papers for her 10th grade class. They taught him that work was not something you complained about. It was something you did, every day, without exception. When Julian was 7 years old, his father took him to a county fair in Montgomery. They stopped at a gas station on the way. Samuel went inside to pay, and Julian waited in the truck. A white man in a pickup truck pulled up next to them. He looked at Julian. He looked at Samuel walking out of the gas station. He rolled down his window. "Boy, you lost? This ain't your kind of place." Samuel did not look at the man. He did not acknowledge him. He simply got into his truck, started the engine, and drove away. Julian watched his father's hands on the steering wheel. They were steady. They did not shake. They did not tremble. But Julian noticed something he had never seen before. His father's knuckles were white. Not from fear, from restraint, from the immense self-control it took to not respond. "Daddy," Julian asked, "why did that man say that to us?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, without taking his eyes off the road, "Son, there are people in this world who will judge you before you open your mouth. They will look at your skin and decide everything they need to know about you. They will not ask your name. They will not ask what you have done or what you can do. They will look at you and they will decide. And you will want to fight them, every time. You will want to prove them wrong. But here is what I need you to understand. The most powerful thing you can do in those moments is not to fight. It is to be patient, because the world has a way of revealing the truth. It takes time, but it always reveals the truth." Julian never forgot those words. They became the foundation of his life. They became the quiet philosophy that guided him through every challenge, every setback, every moment when someone looked at him and saw less than what he was. At 18, Julian left Meridian Cross for the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He had earned a full scholarship. He was one of 3 black students in his incoming class of 1,200. On his first day, a professor asked him if he was lost. On his third day, a classmate asked him if he was on an athletic scholarship. By the end of his first semester, Julian had the highest grades in his entire program. No one asked if he was lost anymore, but they still looked at him differently. They always would. And Julian learned to live with it. Not to accept it, but to live with it, to navigate it, to use it as fuel. He graduated from MIT with a dual degree in computer science and electrical engineering. He was recruited by every major technology company in the country. He chose a small startup in Austin because they let him build things, real things, systems that mattered. He spent 7 years there, rising from junior engineer to vice president of product. And during that time, he met a woman named Cassandra Williams. She was a software architect, brilliant, funny, fierce. They married in a small ceremony in Meridian Cross, with Samuel and Lena in the front row. And 14 months later, Ava was born. Ava Carter entered the world at 3:47 in the morning on a rain-soaked Tuesday in June. She weighed 7 pounds, 4 ounces. She had her mother's eyes and her father's calm. Julian held her in his arms and made a promise. He promised that she would grow up in a world where she would not have to prove her worth before she opened her mouth. He promised that he would build something so big, so undeniable, that no one would ever look at his daughter and decide they already knew everything about her. That promise became CarterSync. Julian founded CarterSync when Ava was 2 years old. He poured everything he had into it. His savings, his time, his marriage. Cassandra supported him for the first 3 years, working full-time as a senior architect while Julian built the company from their garage. But the stress was enormous, the hours were brutal, the uncertainty was constant. By the time Ava was 5, Cassandra and Julian had divorced. It was not bitter, it was not angry. It was simply the reality of two people who had loved each other deeply but could not survive the weight of a startup. Cassandra moved to Seattle. She called Ava every night. She visited every other weekend. And Julian raised his daughter in San Francisco, in a modest house in the Richmond district, where he taught her the same lessons his father had taught him. CarterSync grew slowly at first, then faster, then explosively. Julian had built a system integration platform that allowed airlines, hotels, and transportation companies to unify their booking, security, and customer experience systems into a single, seamless interface. It was not sexy. It was not the kind of technology that made headlines, but it solved a real problem, a massive problem, a problem that every major travel company in the world was desperate to solve. By the time Ava was 10, CarterSync had contracts with 12 major airlines, 40 hotel chains, and 3 national railway systems. The company was valued at $2.3 billion. Julian Carter, the boy from Meridian Cross, the man who had been asked if he was lost on his first day at MIT, was now one of the most powerful people in the entire travel industry. And almost no one knew his face. That was deliberate. Julian did not appear on magazine covers. He did not give keynote speeches at industry conferences. He did not post on social media. He let his work speak for him. He let his company's reputation do the talking. He moved through the world quietly, deliberately, the way his father had driven away from that gas station in Montgomery with white knuckles and steady hands. People underestimated him constantly. He let them. He had learned over 39 years that being underestimated was not a weakness, it was a weapon. Because when people underestimated you, they revealed themselves. They showed you exactly who they were. And then you knew how to deal with them. The contract with Global Atlantic Airways, the airline that operated Flight 247, had been in development for 18 months. Diane Whitmore, the airline's vice president of operations, had pursued CarterSync aggressively. Global Atlantic was struggling. Their booking system was outdated. Their customer experience was ranked dead last among major U.S. carriers. Their stock price had fallen 42% in the past year. The CarterSync contract was their lifeline. Diane knew it. The airline's CEO, a man named Richard Ashworth, knew it. The board of directors knew it. If the contract fell through, Global Atlantic would almost certainly be acquired by a competitor within 12 months. Thousands of employees would lose their jobs. The airline would cease to exist as an independent entity. Diane Whitmore had spent 18 months convincing Julian that Global Atlantic was worth saving. She had flown to San Francisco 7 times. She had taken Julian to dinner. She had sent handwritten notes to Ava on her birthday. She had done everything in her power to build a relationship. And Julian had been impressed, not by the gestures, but by Diane's genuine understanding of what was broken at Global Atlantic and her commitment to fixing it. He had agreed to the contract. The signing was scheduled for tomorrow. And now, at 35,000 feet, hurtling toward San Francisco at 500 miles per hour, Julian was reconsidering everything. The problem was not Monica Hayes. The problem was not even Trevor Blake, the gate agent who had first looked at Julian's boarding pass with suspicion. The problem was systemic. It was cultural. It was the kind of rot that could not be fixed with a software integration, no matter how sophisticated. If the people working for Global Atlantic judged passengers by their appearance, if they humiliated paying customers based on the color of their skin, then the airline was not worth saving. A new booking system would not fix that. A new customer experience platform would not fix that. The problem was not the technology. The problem was the people. And Julian was not sure he wanted to do business with people like that. He thought about his father. He thought about the gas station in Montgomery. He thought about white knuckles on a steering wheel and the quiet restraint of a man who had chosen patience over conflict. His father had been right. The world had a way of revealing the truth. And Global Atlantic Airways had just revealed theirs. Julian pulled out his phone again. He opened the CarterSync internal messaging app. He typed a message to Marcus Chen, his chief operating officer. Marcus, I need you to do something for me. Pull every piece of data we have on Global Atlantic's customer complaint records, specifically complaints related to discrimination, passenger mistreatment, and crew conduct. I want the full picture by the time I land. Not the sanitized version they sent us during due diligence, the real data. The data they did not want us to see. Marcus replied within 30 seconds. On it. Everything okay, Julian? Julian stared at the screen for a moment. Then he typed his reply. No, but it is about to be. He put his phone away and looked out the window. The clouds were thin and wispy, spreading across the sky like cotton pulled apart. Far below, the patchwork fields of the Midwest were giving way to the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains. Julian had flown this route dozens of times. He knew the landmarks. He knew the weather patterns. He knew exactly how long it would take to reach San Francisco. 2 hours and 17 minutes remaining. 2 hours and 17 minutes until the aircraft touched down at SFO. 2 hours and 17 minutes until the world that Global Atlantic Airways had built for themselves came crashing down around them. In the first-class cabin, Monica Hayes was serving champagne to the passengers who had not been removed. She was smiling. She was professional. She was performing the role she had performed for 23 years. She did not know that her career, her reputation, and the entire future of the airline she worked for had just been altered by a man in a gray hoodie. She did not know that the woman in 1C, Evelyn Brooks, had already written a detailed note about the incident on her phone. She did not know that the man in 1A had stopped scrolling through his emails and was instead typing a message to his wife. You will not believe what I just witnessed on this flight. She did not know that somewhere in the economy cabin, in seat 27B, Julian Carter's phone was buzzing with incoming messages from Marcus Chen. Messages that contained data. Data that would make Diane Whitmore's blood run cold. The first message arrived at exactly the 40-minute mark of the flight. Julian opened it. Julian, the complaint data is worse than we thought. Over the past 3 years, Global Atlantic has received more than 2,400 formal complaints related to passenger discrimination. 80% of those complaints involved passengers of color. They settled most of them out of court. Confidentiality agreements, non-disclosure clauses. The board knows about it. Diane's name is on at least 40 of the settlement documents. Julian read the message twice. Then he read it a third time. 2,400 complaints. 40 settlements with Diane Whitmore's name on them. This was not a few bad apples. This was not a Monica Hayes problem. This was a culture that had been cultivated, protected, and covered up at the highest levels of the organization. Diane had spent 18 months convincing Julian that Global Atlantic was worth saving. She had never mentioned the discrimination complaints. She had never mentioned the settlements. She had lied, by omission, by design. Julian typed his reply to Marcus. "Send me everything, every document, every settlement, every name. I want the full picture." Then he opened his email again. The message he had sent to Diane Whitmore earlier was still there. "Diane, there has been a change of plans." He had been angry when he wrote it. He had been humiliated. But now he was something else. He was resolved. Because this was no longer about a seat in first class. This was about something much larger. This was about a company that had been mistreating people for years. People who looked like him. People who did not have $4 billion companies and $240 million contracts to protect them. People who had no leverage. People who had been silenced by settlements and confidentiality agreements and the overwhelming power of a corporation that did not care. Julian Carter was not just a passenger who had been humiliated. He was the one person in the world who had the power to hold Global Atlantic accountable, and he was about to use every ounce of that power. He closed his eyes. The hum of the engines was steady. The cabin was quiet. Outside the window, the Rocky Mountains slid past beneath a blanket of white clouds. In the first-class cabin, Monica Hayes was refilling Mrs. Brooks's champagne glass. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Mrs. Brooks?" Monica asked, her professional smile firmly in place. Mrs. Brooks looked at Monica for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "No, it is not. That man you removed, do you know who he is?" Monica's smile did not falter. "I am sure he is a perfectly fine person, ma'am. But airline policy requires that we verify passenger identity when there is a discrepancy between the booking and the passenger's presentation." Mrs. Brooks shook her head. "Young lady, I have been alive for 76 years. I have seen a lot of people make a lot of mistakes, but I have rarely seen someone make a mistake this big without even realizing it." Monica's smile tightened at the corners. She did not respond. She simply moved on to the next passenger, her practiced professionalism masking the first faint stirrings of unease. It would not be long now. 45 minutes had almost passed, and when they did, the world that Monica Hayes, Trevor Blake, Diane Whitmore, and the entire leadership of Global Atlantic Airways had constructed around themselves would begin to collapse. Some storms arrive with thunder and lightning. This one arrived with an email that Diane Whitmore had just opened, an email that contained 4 words that made her entire body go cold. "Julian, what happened? Please explain." Diane stared at her phone. She read the email again. Then she picked up her office phone and dialed the number for Flight 247's cockpit communications. She did not know what had happened, but she knew, with the certainty of a woman who had spent her entire career reading between the lines of corporate communications, that something had gone terribly, catastrophically wrong. Diane Whitmore was in her office on the 17th floor of Global Atlantic Airways headquarters in San Francisco when the email arrived. She had been reviewing the final preparations for tomorrow's contract signing. The conference room had been booked. The catering had been ordered. The press release had been drafted and approved by legal. 18 months of work. 18 months of negotiations. 18 months of convincing Julian Carter that Global Atlantic was a company worth investing in. And now, at 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, Diane Whitmore was staring at her phone and feeling the floor drop out from under her. "Diane, there has been a change of plans. I am on the flight, but I am no longer in first class. Your staff made sure of that. We need to talk before tomorrow morning, if there is still a tomorrow morning." She read it 5 times, 6 times. Each time the words did not change. Each time the meaning became clearer and more terrifying. Julian Carter was on Flight 247. He had been removed from first class. By her staff. The staff of the airline she was supposed to be running. The staff that, in approximately 2 hours, would deliver Julian Carter to San Francisco International Airport, where he was supposed to be greeted by a car, a welcome committee, and the most important contract in global Atlantic's history. Diane's hands were shaking. She was not a woman who shook. She had spent 26 years in the airline industry. She had worked her way up from a ticket counter agent in Phoenix to the vice president of operations for one of the largest carriers in the United States. She had survived mergers, strikes, bankruptcies, and 3 separate chief executive officers. She had built her career on being unflappable. But right now, in her office, with the San Francisco Bay glittering in the late afternoon sun outside her window, Diane Whitmore was flapped. She picked up her office phone and dialed the number for flight operations. "This is Diane Whitmore. I need to speak with the captain of Flight 247 immediately. It is an emergency." The voice on the other end was young and uncertain. "Ma'am, Flight 247 is currently in the air. Cockpit communications are restricted to air traffic control and operational emergencies." "This is an operational emergency," Diane said. Her voice was calm now. The calm that comes after the panic, when the shock is settled and the survival instincts take over. "Patch me through, now, and do not ask me to repeat myself." There was a pause, then a click, then the sound of a radio frequency being tuned. "Flight 247, this is Global Atlantic Operations. We have an urgent communication from Vice President of Operations Diane Whitmore. Please respond." Another pause, then the captain's voice crackled through the speaker. "Operations, this is Captain David Rosenthal on Flight 247. Go ahead." Diane gripped the phone. "Captain Rosenthal, this is Diane Whitmore. I need you to listen to me very carefully. There is a passenger on your aircraft. His name is Julian Carter. He is in seat 27B. I need you to verify that he is safe, that he is comfortable, and that he has not been subjected to any mistreatment. And Captain, I need you to do this now." Captain Rosenthal was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was cautious. "Ma'am, I am not aware of any issues with passengers on this flight. Is there a security concern I should be aware of?" "No," Diane said, "there is no security concern, but there may be a corporate survival concern. Julian Carter is the founder and CEO of Carter Sync. He is the man we are supposed to sign a $240 million contract with tomorrow morning, and I have just received an email from him indicating that he was removed from first class by our cabin crew. I need to understand what happened, and I need to fix it before this aircraft lands." The silence on the other end of the line was longer this time, much longer. "Ma'am," Captain Rosenthal said finally, "I am going to have my first officer contact the cabin crew. I will call you back within 5 minutes. "Make it 3, Diane said, and she hung up. She stood up from her desk and walked to the window. Outside, the bay was calm. Sailboats drifted across the water. The Golden Gate Bridge stood in the distance, its red towers catching the late afternoon light. It was a beautiful day, a perfect day, the kind of day that was supposed to be the prelude to the biggest victory of Diane Whitmore's career. And instead, it was the day that her entire future had just been thrown into uncertainty by a flight attendant who could not see past a gray hoodie. Diane thought about the discrimination complaints. She thought about the settlements. She knew about them. Of course she knew about them. She had signed off on 40 of them personally. They had been buried in legal documents, hidden behind confidentiality agreements, dismissed as isolated incidents by underperforming employees. But Diane had known. She had always known. And she had done nothing. Because addressing them would have been expensive. It would have been messy. It would have required acknowledging that the airline she helped run had a systemic problem. And Diane Whitmore did not like acknowledging problems she could not solve with a memo and a mandatory training video. Now the problem was sitting in seat 27B, and it was not a problem she could bury in a settlement. Julian Carter had the resources, the evidence, and the moral authority to destroy Global Atlantic Airways, and he had every reason to do exactly that. In the first-class cabin, Monica Hayes was in the galley, preparing the dinner service, when the aircraft's internal phone rang. She picked it up. "This is Monica." The voice on the other end was the first officer. "Monica, "This is First Officer Reynolds. I need you to verify the identity of a passenger for me. His name is Julian Carter. He was originally seated in 2A. Do you know where he is now?" Monica's hand tightened around the phone. Her mind raced. Julian Carter, the man in the hoodie. The man she had removed from first class less than an hour ago. The man who had looked at her with those calm, unreadable eyes and said, "You did not ask who I am." "Yes," Monica said. Her voice was steady, but something in her chest had gone cold. "I know the passenger. He was reseated. There was an issue with his booking." "What kind of issue?" the first officer asked. Monica hesitated. She could lie. She could say that the system had flagged his booking as invalid. She could say that there had been a security concern. She could say anything. But she had a feeling, deep in her gut, that lying was not going to save her now. Not this time. "I believe that the passenger did not match the profile of a first-class traveler," Monica said. The words felt strange in her mouth. Saying them out loud made them sound exactly like what they were: discrimination. The first officer was silent. Then he said, in a voice that was carefully neutral, "Monica, I need you to stay on the line. The captain is going to want to speak with you directly." Monica closed her eyes. She had been a flight attendant for 23 years. She had seen colleagues make mistakes. She had seen them face consequences. She had seen them lose their jobs. But she had never been on the receiving end of that kind of scrutiny. She had always been the one enforcing the rules, the one who decided who belonged and who did not. And now, for the first time in her career, she was the one being questioned. And she did not know how to answer. In the economy cabin, Julian Carter was finishing a cup of coffee. It was bad coffee, the kind of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed 6 hours ago and kept warm on a hot plate ever since. But Julian did not mind. He had drunk worse coffee in server rooms at 3 in the morning. He had drunk worse coffee in his garage while building the first prototype of Carter Sink. Bad coffee was not a problem. Bad coffee was practically a professional requirement in his line of work. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Marcus Chen. "Julian, I have pulled the full complaint database. It is worse than the initial numbers suggested. Over the past 5 years, Global Atlantic has received more than 3,800 discrimination complaints. They settled 94% of them. The average settlement was $18,000. The total payout exceeds $64 million. Diane Whitmore's signature appears on 112 settlement agreements. The CEO, Richard Ashworth, appears on 37. This is not a pattern. This is institutional." Julian read the message, then he read it again. 3,800 complaints, $64 million in settlements, 112 signatures from Diane Whitmore. This was not a few bad apples. This was the orchard. This was the entire tree, roots, trunk, branches, and every single piece of fruit. He typed his reply. "Send the full report to my personal server, encrypted. Do not share it with anyone outside the executive team. I need to think." Marcus replied immediately. "Understood. Julian, whatever you decide to do, you have my full support, and the support of the entire company." Julian put his phone down and stared at the seat back in front of him. He thought about the people who had signed those settlements, the passengers who had been humiliated, removed, degraded, and silenced, the people who did not have the power to fight back, the people who took $18,000 and signed a piece of paper promising never to speak of what happened to them, the people who were not Julian Carter, the people who could not bring a $240 million contract to the negotiating table and demand accountability. He thought about his father, Samuel Carter, who had driven away from a gas station in Montgomery with white knuckles and steady hands. Samuel Carter, who had taught his son that the world would judge him before he opened his mouth. Samuel Carter, who had told Julian that the most powerful thing he could do was be patient, because the world had a way of revealing the truth. His father had been right. The truth had been revealed. And now Julian had to decide what to do with it. In the cockpit of Flight 247, Captain David Rosenthal was having the most uncomfortable conversation of his 32-year career. He had spoken to Monica Hayes. He had heard her explanation. He had listened as she described in halting, defensive sentences what she had done. And now he was on the phone with Diane Whitmore, and he was trying to find the right words to describe an incident that had no right words. "Diane, I have spoken with the cabin crew. It appears that the lead flight attendant in the first-class cabin made a judgment call based on the passenger's appearance. She believed that the passenger did not match the expected profile of a first-class traveler. She asked him to leave the cabin. He complied without resistance. He is currently in seat 27B. He appears to be calm and unharmed." Diane's voice was ice. She believed he did not match the expected profile. "Yes, ma'am." And what, exactly, did she mean by that? Captain Rosenthal hesitated. "Ma'am, I believe she was referring to his clothing and his general presentation. The passenger was wearing a hoodie and jeans. He did not have visible luggage beyond a backpack." Diane was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, but no less deadly. "Captain, let me tell you something about the man you just allowed your crew to humiliate. Julian Carter is the founder and CEO of CarterSync, a $4 billion technology company. He holds a bachelor's degree and a master's degree from MIT. He employs more than 2,000 people. Forbes estimated his personal net worth last year at $1.2 billion. He has 12 patents registered with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And tomorrow morning, he was supposed to sign a contract that would have saved our airline from financial collapse. Instead, he is sitting in row 27, drinking economy-class coffee, reconsidering whether Global Atlantic Airways deserves to exist." Captain Rosenthal did not respond. There was nothing to say. There was nothing that could be said. "I want you to do something for me," Diane continued. "I want you to walk back to seat 27B. I want you to apologize on behalf of the entire airline. I want you to invite him back to first class. I want you to offer him anything he wants. Anything. A full refund, a lifetime of free flights, a handwritten apology from every person in this company's leadership. I want you to do whatever it takes to make sure that man gets off this aircraft feeling respected. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am," Captain Rosenthal said. "I will go now." He hung up the intercom and turned to his first officer. "You have the controls for a few minutes. I need to handle something in the cabin." The first officer nodded. He knew better than to ask questions. Captain Rosenthal unbuckled his harness, stood up, and opened the cockpit door. He walked through the first-class cabin. Monica Hayes was standing near the galley, and when she saw the captain, her face went pale. He did not stop to speak to her. He simply walked past her, through the curtain, into the economy cabin. The passengers in economy looked up as the captain walked down the aisle. Captains did not walk through the economy cabin. Captains stayed in the cockpit. The fact that one was walking through the cabin now, in the middle of the flight, meant something unusual was happening. The passengers watched him. They whispered to each other. They pulled out their phones. Captain Rosenthal stopped at row 27. He looked at the man in the window seat, the man in the gray hoodie, the man who was calmly drinking bad coffee as if nothing in the world were wrong. "Mr. Carter," Captain Rosenthal said. His voice was formal, respectful, the voice of a man who knew he was speaking to someone who outranked him in every way that mattered. "On behalf of Global Atlantic Airways, I would like to offer you my deepest and most sincere apologies for the treatment you have received on this flight. There is no excuse for what happened. I have been authorized to invite you back to the first-class cabin with our full apologies and to offer you anything you require to make this right." The cabin went silent. Every passenger within earshot was staring. The man who had been removed from first class, the man in the hoodie, the man who was apparently so important that the captain himself had left the cockpit to apologize to him. Julian looked up at Captain Rosenthal. His expression was calm, unreadable. He took a sip of his coffee. "Captain," Julian said, "I appreciate the gesture, but I am comfortable where I am. I paid for a first-class seat. Your crew decided I did not belong in it. I am not going to accept an invitation back to a seat that was mine to begin with." Captain Rosenthal did not know how to respond. He had not expected this. He had expected acceptance, gratitude, relief. He had not expected a calm refusal delivered with the quiet authority of a man who knew exactly how much power he held. "Mr. Carter," the captain said carefully, "I understand your frustration, but I would like to do everything in my power to resolve this situation before we land." Julian set down his coffee cup. He looked at Captain Rosenthal with the same steady gaze he had used on Monica Hayes. "Captain, I am not frustrated. I am not angry. I am simply doing what your airline apparently does not know how to do. I am judging your company by its actions, not by its apologies." He turned back to the window. The conversation was over. Captain Rosenthal stood in the aisle for a moment longer. Then he nodded once and walked back toward the cockpit. As he passed through the first-class cabin, he looked at Monica Hayes. He did not say a word. He did not need to. The look in his eyes said everything. Her career was over. She just did not know it yet. Flight 247 began its descent in the San Francisco International Airport at 6:12 p.m. Pacific Time. The late afternoon sun had melted into a golden haze over the Pacific Ocean, painting the bay in shades of amber and rose. The aircraft banked gently to the left, aligning itself with the runway, and the passengers felt the familiar shift in gravity as the plane dropped toward the earth. It was a beautiful descent. Smooth, graceful. The kind of descent that pilots dream about. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere was anything but smooth. Word had spread. It always does. A passenger in row 25 had overheard Captain Rosenthal's apology. She had texted her sister. Her sister had posted it on social media. Within 15 minutes, the story was trending on multiple platforms with the hashtag #BlackCEO thrown out of first class. News outlets were calling Global Atlantic's Media Relations Department. The airline's social media accounts were being flooded with angry comments. The corporate communications team was in full crisis mode, and Diane Whitmore was pacing the floor of the gate area at Terminal 3, waiting for the aircraft to land. She had assembled a team. Her executive assistant, 2 senior vice presidents, the head of public relations, and 3 lawyers from the corporate legal department. They stood in a tight cluster near the gate, dressed in expensive suits, clutching tablets and phones, looking like a delegation sent to negotiate a hostage release. And in a sense, that was exactly what they were. The hostage was not a person. The hostage was the $240 million contract. The hostage was the future of Global Atlantic Airways. And Diane Whitmore was the one who was going to have to negotiate its release. She had tried calling Julian Carter's phone 4 times. Each time, it had gone to voicemail. She had sent 5 text messages, each one more desperate than the last. "Julian, please let me fix this. Julian, I am so sorry. Julian, whatever happened, we can make it right. Julian, the contract is bigger than one incident. Julian, please." He had not responded to any of them, and Diane understood, with a clarity that made her stomach clench, that Julian Carter was not going to let her fix this with words. He was going to make her fix it with actions, and she did not yet know what those actions would need to be. In the economy cabin, Julian Carter fastened his seatbelt for landing. He had spent the last hour and a half in silence, staring out the window, thinking. He had read Marcus Chen's full report. He had reviewed the settlement documents. He had seen the names of the passengers who had been silenced. He had read their stories. A woman from Atlanta who had been removed from a flight because a crew member said her headscarf made other passengers uncomfortable. A father from Houston who had been told his son could not sit in business class because children were not allowed. A doctor from Philadelphia who had been accused of stealing the first-class amenity kit because she looked like she could not afford one. Story after story, name after name, a pattern of cruelty and humiliation that stretched back years. And Julian had made his decision. He was not going to sign the contract. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Not until Global Atlantic Airways proved, with concrete and verifiable actions, that it had changed. Not until the people who had perpetrated and covered up this culture of discrimination were held accountable. Not until Diane Whitmore understood that a $240 million contract was not a shield. It was a lever, and Julian Carter was about to pull it. The aircraft touched down at 6:37 p.m. The wheels kissed the runway with a gentle squeal, and the passengers applauded, as passengers always do. Because there is something about landing safely that makes people forget, for a moment, that flying is the safest form of travel in human history. The applause was brief. Then the phones came out. Everyone wanted to be the first to post that they had landed. Everyone wanted to check their messages. And in seat 27B, Julian Carter's phone was buzzing with notifications. 42 missed calls, 67 text messages, 11 emails from Diane Whitmore's personal account, each one marked with the red exclamation point of high importance. He did not read them. He did not need to. He knew what they said. He put his phone in his pocket and waited. The aircraft taxied to the gate. The seatbelt sign dinged off. The passengers stood up, pulling bags from overhead bins, blocking the aisles, doing the awkward dance of people who are all trying to leave at the same time. But in the first-class cabin, something unusual was happening. The passengers were not standing. They were waiting. They were watching the curtain that separated first class from economy. They were waiting to see the man in the gray hoodie walk through. They had spent 2 hours thinking about what had happened. They had spent 2 hours replaying the moment when Monica Hayes had leaned over Julian Carter's seat and told him he did not belong. And now they wanted to see how the story ended. Monica Hayes was standing near the forward exit door, her face pale, her hands clasped in front of her. She had not spoken to anyone for the last hour of the flight. She had not served any more drinks. She had not checked on any passengers. She had simply stood in the galley, staring at the wall, replaying her own actions in her head. She had been a flight attendant for 23 years. She had served presidents, celebrities, CEOs, and royalty. She had never made a mistake like this. She had never misjudged a passenger so completely. And now, as the aircraft sat at the gate and the passengers prepared to disembark, Monica Hayes was about to face the consequences of her judgment. Not in a courtroom, not in a human resources meeting, but right here, right now, in front of everyone. The curtain parted. Julian Carter walked through. He was still wearing his gray hoodie. He was still carrying his worn brown leather backpack. He looked exactly the same as he had when Monica had removed him from first class. But the way the other passengers looked at him had changed entirely. The man in 1A, the one who had been scrolling through emails, nodded at Julian with something that looked like respect. The couple in 3A and 3C watched him with wide eyes. And Evelyn Brooks, the 76-year-old woman in 1C, stood up from her seat and walked toward Julian. "Young man," she said. Her voice was clear and strong, the voice of a woman who had spent 7 decades refusing to be silenced. "I want you to know that I saw what happened. I wrote it down, every detail. If you need a witness, I am here. My name is Evelyn Brooks. I live in Palo Alto, and I do not forget things." Julian looked at Mrs. Brooks for a moment. Then he smiled. It was a real smile this time, not the smile he had given Monica Hayes, not the smile of a man who knew something no one else did. This was the smile of a man who had just been reminded that not everyone in the world was like Monica Hayes, that some people still believed in doing the right thing. "Thank you, Mrs. Brooks," Julian said. "I will remember that." Mrs. Brooks nodded once, firmly, and stepped back. Julian walked toward the exit, toward Monica Hayes, toward the door that would take him off this aircraft and into whatever came next. Monica did not move. She was supposed to stand at the exit, thank passengers for flying with Global Atlantic, and wish them a pleasant evening. It was her job. It was the simplest, most automatic part of her job, but she could not do it. She could not look Julian Carter in the eye and say the words she had said to thousands of passengers before him. Because the words would be hollow, they would be meaningless. They would be an insult added to an injury that was already deep enough. "Sir," Monica said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I am so sorry. I did not know who you were." Julian stopped. He looked at Monica Hayes. He looked at her the same way he had looked at her 2 hours ago, when she had told him to leave the first-class cabin. Calm, steady, unreadable. "Monica," Julian said, "that is exactly the problem. You should not have needed to know who I was. You should have treated me with respect because I am a human being, not because I am a CEO, not because I have money, not because I might be important to your company's future. You should have treated me with respect because every passenger on this aircraft deserves to be treated with respect. And you did not do that. Not for me, and I suspect not for a lot of other people." Monica's eyes filled with tears. She did not try to hide them. She did not try to defend herself. She simply stood there, in her uniform, in front of her passengers, and let the tears fall. Julian did not wait for her response. He walked past her, through the exit door, and into the jet bridge. The air was cool and smelled of jet fuel and rubber. The tunnel was long and slightly curved, so you could not see the gate area until you were almost there. Julian walked slowly. He could hear the other passengers behind him, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. He could hear Mrs. Brooks's cane tapping against the floor. He could hear the faint murmur of conversation as people processed what they had just witnessed. And then he rounded the curve, and he saw them. Diane Whitmore was standing at the end of the jet bridge, flanked by her team of executives and lawyers. She was wearing a dark blue suit and a white blouse. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun. She looked like she had not slept in 3 days. Behind her, the gate area was crowded with people. Passengers waiting for the next flight, airport staff, and, unmistakably, reporters. 3 of them. Cameras ready, microphones in hand. Someone at the airport had tipped off the local news. The story had broken. The black CEO thrown out of first class was about to become national news. Julian stepped into the gate area. Diane Whitmore rushed toward him, her hand extended, her face a mask of professional concern. "Julian," she said. Her voice was breathless. "I am so incredibly sorry. I do not even know where to begin. Please, let me take you somewhere private. Let me explain. Let me make this right." Julian did not take her hand. He looked at her. He looked at the team of executives behind her. He looked at the reporters. He looked at the passengers from Flight 247 who were now streaming out of the jet bridge behind him, phones raised, recording everything. "Diane," Julian said. His voice was calm, quiet, but it carried. It carried through the entire gate area. The reporters leaned in. The passengers stopped walking. The airport staff paused what they were doing. Everyone was listening. "I have been on your aircraft for 2 hours and 34 minutes. In that time, my team has pulled your company's discrimination complaint records for the past 5 years. Do you know what we found?" Diane's face went pale. "Julian, I can explain. 3,800 complaints," Julian continued. $64 million in settlements. Your signature on 112 of them. This is not about a flight attendant who had a bad day. This is about a company that has systematically mistreated its passengers for years.
A company that silences its victims with settlements and confidentiality agreements. A company that you, Diane, have allowed to operate this way. And you want me to sign a contract that would validate all of that? Diane opened her mouth, closed it. She had nothing to say. There was nothing she could say. The reporters were writing furiously. The cameras were recording. The passengers were uploading videos to every social media platform they could think of. And Julian Carter stood in the center of it all, calm and quiet, a man in a gray hoodie who had just dismantled a billion-dollar corporation's leadership with nothing but the truth. "I am not going to sue your airline," Julian said. "I'm not going to make a scene. I am going to go home to my daughter. I'm going to have dinner. I'm going to sleep in my own bed. And tomorrow morning, I'm going to decide whether Global Atlantic Airways deserves a second chance. And Diane, I want you to understand something. That decision will not be based on how much money you offer me. It will not be based on how many apologies you send. It will be based on whether you are willing to do what you should have done years ago. Hold people accountable. Change the culture. Make sure that no one else is ever removed from a seat they paid for because of how they look. He paused. He looked at the executives behind Diane. He looked at the lawyers. He looked at the reporters. Then he looked back at Diane. You have 24 hours. Do not waste them. Julian Carter turned and walked away. He walked through the terminal, past the food courts and the duty-free shops and the crowds of travelers rushing to catch their flights. He walked with his backpack on one shoulder, his hoodie still rumpled, his sneakers still worn. He looked like a graduate student. He looked like someone who should not have been able to bring a billion-dollar airline to its knees. But that was the thing about Julian Carter. He had spent his entire life being underestimated, and he had built his entire career on proving that the people who underestimated him were wrong. Behind him in the gate area, the cameras kept rolling, the reporters kept writing, and Diane Whitmore stood frozen in the center of the chaos, her team of executives and lawyers surrounding her, all of them realizing at the same moment that the most important 24 hours of their careers had just begun. In the first-class cabin of Flight 247, Monica Hayes was still standing at the exit door. The passengers had all left. The aircraft was empty. She was alone. She looked at the empty seat in row 2A, the seat that Julian Carter should have been sitting in, the seat that he had paid for, the seat that she had taken from him. And for the first time in 23 years, Monica Hayes did not know what the next day would bring. But she had a feeling that it would not be good. The 24 hours that followed Flight 247's arrival at San Francisco International Airport were the most consequential in Global Atlantic Airways' 47-year history. By the time Julian Carter walked out of Terminal 3, the story was already spreading faster than the airline's crisis management team could contain it. The video of Captain Rosenthal apologizing to Julian in the economy cabin had been posted by a passenger in row 25 and had already accumulated 2.3 million views. A separate video, recorded by a passenger standing near the gate, showed Julian Carter calmly dismantling Diane Whitmore in front of her entire executive team. That video had 4.1 million views and was climbing by the minute. The hashtag #BlackCEO thrown out of first class was trending in 12 countries, and the morning news cycle had not even begun. Diane Whitmore did not go home that night. She could not. She returned to Global Atlantic headquarters with her team at 7:45 p.m. and convened an emergency meeting in the boardroom on the 17th floor. The entire executive leadership team was present. Richard Ashworth, the CEO, joined via video conference from his vacation home in Aspen, Colorado. His face on the screen was the color of old newspaper. He had been informed of the situation 2 hours ago, and he had spent every minute since then trying to understand how a single flight attendant's judgment call had metastasized into an existential threat to his company. "Diane," Richard said. His voice was controlled, but there was a tremor underneath it. The kind of tremor that comes when a person realizes that everything they have built is suddenly at risk. "Give me the full picture. Do not sugarcoat it. Do not leave anything out. I need to know exactly how bad this is." Diane stood at the head of the table. She had not slept. She had not eaten. Her suit was wrinkled. Her hair was coming loose from its bun, but her voice was steady. "It is worse than we thought, Richard. Julian Carter's team has pulled our entire discrimination complaint database. They have access to records we did not know were accessible. 3,800 complaints over 5 years, $64 million in settlements." My signature on 112 agreements. Your signature on 37. He knows everything, and he has given us 24 hours to present a plan for systemic change before he walks away from the contract entirely. The boardroom went silent. The executives around the table exchanged glances. Some of them had known about the complaints. Some of them had signed settlements themselves. Some of them had spent years pretending that the problem did not exist, that it was just a few isolated incidents, that the airline's culture was basically sound. None of them could pretend anymore. Richard Ashworth took a deep breath. Then he said the words that Diane had been dreading. We need to make a public statement, a full press conference, tonight. We need to get ahead of this before the morning news cycle buries us, and we need to announce concrete actions, not promises, actions. Heads need to roll, Diane. Diane nodded. She had already prepared the list. Monica Hayes, the lead flight attendant on Flight 247, would be terminated immediately. Trevor Blake, the gate agent who had first flagged Julian's boarding pass, would be terminated as well. Both firings would be announced publicly as part of the airline's commitment to accountability. But Diane knew that firing 2 low-level employees was not going to be enough. Julian Carter had not told the world about 3,800 complaints because he wanted Monica Hayes fired. He had told the world because he wanted systemic change. And systemic change meant consequences for the people at the top. Richard, Diane said, there is something else you need to know. Julian did not just want an apology from the airline. He wanted accountability from me, specifically. He mentioned my signature on the settlements. He mentioned it in front of the reporters, in front of the cameras. If we are going to survive this, I think I need to resign. The room went still. Richard Ashworth stared at Diane through the video screen. He had known Diane for 18 years. She had been his most trusted lieutenant. She had helped him navigate 3 hostile takeover attempts, a bankruptcy scare, and a labor strike that had grounded the airline for 11 days. She was the most competent executive he had ever worked with. And she was offering to fall on her sword. Diane, Richard said quietly, if you resign, we lose our best chance of keeping Julian Carter at the table. He knows you. He has a relationship with you. You built that relationship over 18 months. If you step down, we lose the only bridge we have left. Then what do you suggest? Diane asked. Richard was silent for a moment. Then he said, I suggest that we give him what he wants, not just an apology, not just a few firings, real change, a complete overhaul of our customer service training program, an independent investigation into every discrimination complaint from the past 5 years, a public compensation fund for passengers who were mistreated. And I am going to fly to San Francisco tonight and beg Julian Carter for forgiveness, in person, on my knees if I have to. The executives around the table stared at their CEO. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. Richard Ashworth, the man who had built Global Atlantic Airways into one of the largest carriers in the United States, was talking about getting on his knees and begging. The situation was that bad, and everyone in that room knew it. The press conference was held at 11 p.m. Pacific Time in the lobby of Global Atlantic Airways headquarters. The room was packed. Every major news network had sent a crew: CNN, MS, NBC, Fox News, ABC, NBC, CBS. Local affiliates from San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York. Online outlets, industry publications. The story had transcended business news. It was now a national conversation about race, about corporate accountability, and about what happens when the people who run billion-dollar companies are forced to confront the consequences of their own negligence. Diane Whitmore stood at the podium. She had changed into a fresh suit. She had fixed her hair. She looked composed, but her eyes were red. She had been crying. She did not try to hide it. "Good evening," she began. Her voice echoed through the lobby. "Tonight, Global Atlantic Airways is facing a crisis of our own making." Earlier today, a passenger on Flight 247 from Chicago to San Francisco was removed from the first-class cabin by a member of our cabin crew. That passenger was Julian Carter, the founder and CEO of Carter Sync, a valued business partner with whom we have been negotiating a major contract. But Mr. Carter's identity is not the point. The point is that he was removed from his seat based on his appearance, based on a judgment made by our employee about whether he looked like he belonged. That judgment was wrong. It was discriminatory. And it is part of a pattern that this company has allowed to continue for far too long. Diane paused. She looked down at her notes. Then she looked back up at the cameras. Over the past 5 years, Global Atlantic Airways has received more than 3,800 formal discrimination complaints from passengers. We settled most of those complaints out of court. We required passengers to sign confidentiality agreements. We buried the problem instead of fixing it. I signed many of those settlements myself. I am not here to make excuses. I am here to take responsibility. Effective immediately, the 2 employees directly involved in today's incident have been terminated. But that is not enough. And I know it is not enough. She took a breath. Tomorrow morning, Global Atlantic Airways will announce a comprehensive reform program. An independent investigation into every discrimination complaint. A public compensation fund for affected passengers. A complete overhaul of our training and hiring practices. And a new executive position reporting directly to the board, dedicated solely to ensuring that what happened today never happens again. We will release the full details at 9 a.m. Pacific Time. Until then, I want to say directly to Mr. Carter and to every passenger who has ever been mistreated by this airline, I am sorry. We failed you, and we are going to do everything in our power to earn back your trust. Diane stepped away from the podium. The room erupted in questions. Reporters shouted over each other, cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward. But Diane did not answer any of the questions. She simply walked away, her heels clicking on the marble floor, her face set in an expression of grim determination. She had done what she needed to do. Now, she had to wait and see if it was enough. Julian Carter watched the press conference from his living room in the Richmond district. Ava was asleep upstairs. He had made her dinner, pasta with marinara sauce, the same recipe his mother had taught him when he was 12 years old. He had helped Ava with her math homework. He had read her a chapter of the book she was reading for school, a novel about a girl who traveled through time. And then he had tucked her into bed, kissed her forehead, and told her he loved her. She had asked him how his flight was. He had said it was eventful. She had rolled her eyes. "Daddy, you always say that." Now he was sitting on his couch, watching Diane Whitmore apologize to the world on his television. His phone was buzzing. Messages from Marcus Chen, messages from his legal team, messages from reporters who had somehow gotten his personal number. He ignored all of them. He just watched the screen. When Diane finished speaking, Julian turned off the television. He sat in the dark living room for a long time. He thought about his father. He thought about the gas station in Montgomery. He thought about white knuckles on a steering wheel and the quiet restraint of a man who had chosen patience over conflict. His father had told him that the world would reveal the truth. And it had. The truth was now on every news channel in the country. The truth was trending on social media. The truth was going to be on the front page of every major newspaper tomorrow morning. But the truth was not enough. Julian knew that. The truth was just the first step. The real work was what came next. The real work was making sure that the changes Global Atlantic was promising actually happened. The real work was making sure that 3,800 complaints did not become 4,000, then 5,000, then 10,000. The real work was making sure that the next Julian Carter, the one who did not have a $4 billion company behind him, the one who could not bring a $240 million contract to the table, would be treated with dignity and respect. That was the real work. And Julian was not done yet. At 7 a.m. the next morning, Julian Carter received a phone call. It was from Richard Ashworth, the CEO of Global Atlantic Airways. Julian had never spoken to Richard directly. Their interactions had always been mediated through Diane Whitmore. But Richard's voice on the phone was strained, almost breathless, as if he had been running. "Mr. Carter," Richard said,
"Thank you for taking my call. I am in San Francisco. I flew in this morning.
"I would like to meet with you, anytime, any place. I need to apologize to you in person, and I need to discuss what we are going to do to fix this." Julian was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I have a condition." "Anything," Richard said. "You will meet with me in a public place, not in a boardroom, not in an office, somewhere where anyone can see us, somewhere where there will be witnesses." Richard did not hesitate. "Name the place." Julian thought for a moment. Then he said, "The Ferry Building Marketplace. There is a coffee shop on the south end. I will be there at noon." "I will be there," Richard said. Julian hung up. He finished his breakfast. He helped Ava pack her lunch for school. He walked her to the bus stop and waved as the bus pulled away. Then he went back inside, put on his gray hoodie, and prepared to meet the man who ran the airline that had humiliated him. The Ferry Building Marketplace was crowded when Julian arrived. Tourists, office workers on lunch breaks, families pushing strollers. The coffee shop on the south end was a small, unassuming place with wooden tables and exposed brick walls. Julian ordered a black coffee and sat at a table near the window where anyone walking by could see him. He waited. Richard Ashworth arrived 10 minutes early. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He was tall, silver-haired, and distinguished, the kind of man who looked like he had been born to run a major corporation. But his face was hollow. His eyes were ringed with dark circles. He had not slept. He had not eaten. He had spent the past 12 hours in a state of near constant panic, and it showed. "Mr. Carter," Richard said, approaching the table. His voice was quiet, humbled. "May I sit down?" Julian gestured to the chair across from him. Richard sat. For a moment, neither man spoke.
The sounds of the marketplace filled the silence. Espresso machines hissing, people chatting, a street musician playing guitar somewhere in the distance. Then Richard Ashworth did something that no one in that marketplace expected. He slid his chair back. He stood up. He walked around the table. And in full view of every tourist and every office worker and every family pushing a stroller, he knelt down in front of Julian Carter. The marketplace went quiet. People stopped walking. People stopped talking. People pulled out their phones. The CEO of Global Atlantic Airways, a man worth an estimated $300 million, was on his knees in front of a man in a gray hoodie, and everyone was watching. "Mr. Carter," Richard said. His voice cracked. "I am not here as a CEO. I am here as a human being. What happened to you yesterday was unforgivable. What this company has done to thousands of passengers over the years is unforgivable. I did not know the full extent of it. That is not an excuse. It is a confession. I was negligent. I was complacent. I allowed a culture to develop in my company that treated people as less than human because of how they looked. And I am here, on my knees, to ask for your forgiveness. Not as a business partner, as a person." Julian looked at Richard Ashworth. He looked at the man on his knees in front of him. He looked at the phones recording everything. He looked at the crowd that had gathered around them. Then he spoke. "Richard," Julian said, "get up." Richard did not get up. "I said get up," Julian repeated. His voice was firm but not unkind. "I am not going to have this conversation with you on your knees. I am not interested in humiliation. I am not interested in revenge. I am interested in change. So get up, sit down, and talk to me like an equal." Slowly, hesitantly, Richard Ashworth got to his feet. He sat down across from Julian. His hands were shaking. "I saw your press conference last night," Julian said. "I heard what Diane said, and I am going to be honest with you. Words are not enough. Promises are not enough. I have seen too many companies make promises after a crisis and then go back to business as usual the moment the cameras were gone. If you want my contract, if you want my partnership, you are going to have to prove that this time is different." Richard nodded. "Tell me what you need." Julian leaned forward. "First, the independent investigation Diane mentioned. I want it run by an external firm, not one of your choosing, one that I approve. I want their findings made public. No redactions, no confidentiality agreements. The world gets to see exactly what happened and who was responsible." "Done," Richard said. "Second," Julian continued, "the compensation fund. I want it to cover every passenger who filed a discrimination complaint in the past 5 years. Not just the ones who sued, all of them. And I want you to release them from their confidentiality agreements. Every single one. If they want to tell their stories, they should be free to do so." Richard hesitated. That could expose us to significant legal liability. Julian looked at him. Yes, it could. Richard took a breath. Then he nodded. "Done." "Third," Julian said, "I want the 2 employees involved in my incident, Monica Hayes and Trevor Blake, to be offered something beyond termination. Counseling, education, a chance to understand what they did and why it was wrong. I do not believe in destroying people's lives. I believe in giving people the opportunity to change. But they have to want to change, and that is up to them." Richard stared at Julian. Of all the demands he had expected, this was not one of them. He had expected Julian to demand punishment, to demand that the people who humiliated him be blacklisted from the industry. Instead, Julian was asking for mercy. Not forgiveness, not forgetting, but mercy. "I will make sure it happens," Richard said quietly. "Fourth," Julian said, "and this is the most important one. I want you to create a permanent oversight committee, made up of passengers, civil rights organizations, and independent auditors. They will have full access to your complaint records, your training programs, and your hiring data. They will publish a public report every 6 months on your progress. If you backslide, the world will know." Richard nodded slowly. "That is a significant commitment." "Yes," Julian said, "it is. And if you are not willing to make it, then this conversation is over." Richard Ashworth sat in silence for a long moment. The crowd around them had grown. There were at least 50 people watching now. Phones raised, cameras recording. The moment was being broadcast to the world in real time. Richard knew that whatever he said next would define the rest of his career. And, more importantly, it would define the future of the airline he had spent his life building.
"Mr. Carter," Richard said finally, "I came here prepared to offer you anything. Money, contracts, executive positions. I thought I understood what this was about. But you have shown me that I did not understand at all. You are not asking for revenge. You are asking for justice, not just for yourself, for everyone. For the 3,800 people we silenced. For the people who will fly with us in the future. For everyone who deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of what they look like or what they wear." He paused. He looked Julian directly in the eye. "I accept all of your conditions, every single one. And I am going to spend the rest of my career making sure that my company lives up to them." Julian looked at Richard for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. "Then we have a deal," Julian said. Richard took his hand. The crowd around them erupted in applause. Strangers were hugging each other. People were crying. The video of the moment was already spreading across the internet. The image of a billionaire CEO kneeling in front of a man in a gray hoodie,
had been captured from 17 different angles. But the image that would define the story was the one that came next. The image of two men, one in a suit and one in a hoodie, shaking hands across a coffee shop table. Not as adversaries, not as supplicant and benefactor, as equals, as partners, as human beings who had found a way through the worst of what divides us and arrived at something that looked, finally, like hope. 6 months after Julian Carter walked off Flight 247, the world looked different. Not transformed, not healed, but different. The kind of different that happens when a single moment, captured on dozens of phones and broadcast to millions of screens, forces a society to confront something it had been pretending not to see. Global Atlantic Airways was still flying.
Its planes still crossed the country, carrying passengers from Chicago to San Francisco, from New York to Los Angeles, from Miami to Seattle. But the airline was not the same. And neither were the people who had been part of the story. Monica Hayes had not worked as a flight attendant since the day she was terminated. The first few weeks after her firing were the hardest. She did not leave her apartment. She did not answer her phone. She did not read the news. She sat on her couch in her small one-bedroom apartment in Elk Grove Village, Illinois, and replayed the moment over and over in her head. The way Julian Carter had looked at her, the way he had said, "You should have treated me with respect because I am a human being." The way his words had cut through 23 years of professional pride and left something raw and exposed underneath. Monica had never thought of herself as a racist. She had black friends, she told herself.
She had served black passengers in first class before. She was not prejudiced. She was just doing her job. She was just following her instincts. She was just trying to maintain the standards of the first-class cabin. But as the weeks passed, and as she sat alone in her apartment with nothing but her thoughts for company, Monica began to understand something that she had avoided understanding for her entire career. You do not have to think of yourself as a racist to do racist things. You do not have to hate anyone to treat them as less than they are. You just have to stop questioning your own assumptions. You just have to let your instincts guide you without ever asking where those instincts came from. And Monica had done exactly that for 23 years. She enrolled in a program. It was not court-ordered. It was not required by the airline. It was her own decision. The program was called the Race Equity Institute, and it was run by a woman named Dr. Angela Foster, a sociologist who had spent 30 years studying implicit bias in workplace environments. Monica went to her first session expecting to be lectured. She expected to be told she was a bad person. She expected to be blamed. What she got instead was something far more uncomfortable. She got questions. "Tell me about the first time you noticed someone's race," Dr. Foster said. Monica thought about it. She was 6 years old. She was at a grocery store with her mother. A black woman was in line ahead of them, and Monica's mother had pulled her to a different line. Monica had asked why. Her mother had said, "Because they are different from us." That was it. One sentence, one moment, one seed planted in the soil of a 6-year-old's mind. And it had grown there, quietly, invisibly, for 41 years. Monica told Dr. Foster the story. She cried while she told it. She had never told anyone that story before. She had never even admitted to herself that she remembered it. But she did remember it, and she understood now that it had shaped everything. Every glance, every assumption, every split-second judgment. Every time she had looked at a passenger and decided, without evidence, without reason, without a single fact to support her conclusion, that they did not belong. The program lasted 12 weeks. Monica attended every session. She did the readings. She did the exercises. She had conversations that were painful and necessary and long overdue. At the end of the 12 weeks, she wrote a letter. It was addressed to Julian Carter. She did not know if he would read it. She did not know if he would care, but she wrote it anyway. "Dear Mr. Carter," the letter began, "I do not expect you to forgive me. I do not expect you to respond to this letter. I am writing because I need you to know that what happened on Flight 247 changed me.
Not because I lost my job, not because my name was in the news, but because you said something to me that no one had ever said before. You said I should have treated you with respect because you are a human being. Not because of who you were, just because of what you are. And I realized in that moment that I had spent 23 years not doing that. Not just with you, with a lot of people. I am not writing to ask for anything. I am writing to say, thank you for telling me the truth, even though it hurt, even though it cost me everything. It was the truth I needed to hear. I hope you are well. I hope your daughter is well. I hope you know that what you did on that flight mattered. It mattered to me. And I suspect it mattered to a lot of other people too. Sincerely, Monica Hayes. She mailed the letter to Carter Sink headquarters. She did not expect a response, and she did not receive one. But 3 weeks later, she received something else, a package. Inside was a book. It was called The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. There was a handwritten note tucked inside the cover. The note said, Monica, I received your letter. I am glad you are doing the work. This book helped me understand myself when I was young. I hope it helps you too. Julian Carter. Monica read the book in 3 days. Then she read it again. She did not claim to understand everything in it. She was a 52-year-old white woman from Illinois. She knew there were things about the black experience in America that she would never fully understand. But she was trying. For the first time in her life, she was trying. Trevor Blake, the gate agent who had flagged Julian's boarding pass, took a different path. Unlike Monica, Trevor did not believe he had done anything wrong. He had been a gate agent for 11 years. He had been trained to identify suspicious behavior.
He had been taught that first-class passengers looked a certain way, dressed a certain way, carried themselves a certain way. Julian Carter had not fit the profile. Trevor had flagged his boarding pass. That was his job. The fact that Julian turned out to be a billionaire CEO did not change the fact that Trevor had been following his training. But that was the problem, and Trevor could not see it. He could not see that the training itself was the problem. He could not see that the profile he had been taught to identify was not a profile of legitimate passengers. It was a profile of race and class and appearance. It was a profile that had been built, layer by layer, over decades, by people who shared the same assumptions and the same blind spots. Trevor had been following the training, but the training was wrong, and Trevor had never questioned it. After he was fired, Trevor gave several interviews to conservative media outlets. He presented himself as a victim of cancel culture. He said he had been scapegoated for doing his job. He said Julian Carter had used his wealth and influence to destroy an ordinary working man's career. The interviews generated a small wave of sympathy from people who were looking for reasons to dismiss the larger conversation about discrimination. But the wave was small, and it faded quickly. Most people could see the situation for what it was. A man had been removed from a seat he paid for because of how he looked. The gate agent who flagged him and the flight attendant who removed him had both acted on assumptions rooted in bias. And no amount of complaining about cancel culture was going to change those facts. Trevor eventually moved to a different state. He took a job at a warehouse. He stopped giving interviews. He faded from public view. And the world moved on without him. Because the world always moves on. The question is whether you move with it. Monica Hayes had chosen to move with it. Trevor Blake had not. And the difference between those two choices was the difference between growth and stagnation, between understanding and denial, between a life that opens up and a life that shuts down. Evelyn Brooks was exactly where she wanted to be. At 76 years old, she had not expected to become a public figure. She had spent her life as a librarian, 43 years at the Palo Alto Public Library, in the reference section, helping people find information. She had raised 2 children. She had buried a husband. She had lived a quiet, steady, meaningful life. And then she had taken Flight 247 to visit her grandson in San Francisco, and everything had changed. The story of how Mrs. Brooks had stood up to Monica Hayes in the first-class cabin had captured the public's imagination. Here was a woman who had seen segregation, who had lived through the civil rights movement, who had witnessed the progress and the backlash and the slow, uneven arc of history. And when she saw injustice happening in front of her, she did not look away. She did not stay silent. She spoke up. She told a flight attendant who was humiliating a passenger that what she was doing was wrong, and she offered to be a witness. Julian Carter had not forgotten. 3 months after the incident, he invited Mrs. Brooks to the Carter Sync headquarters in San Francisco. He gave her a tour of the building. He introduced her to his daughter Ava. He thanked her, publicly and privately, for her courage. And then he asked her if she would be willing to serve on the oversight committee he had proposed to Global Atlantic Airways. Evelyn Brooks had laughed when he asked. "Young man," she said, "I am 76 years old. I do not know anything about airlines." Julian had smiled. "Mrs. Brooks, you know about people. You know about fairness. You know about doing the right thing even when it is hard. That is exactly what this committee needs." She had accepted. And 6 months later, at a ceremony in Washington, D.C., Evelyn Brooks received the Presidential Citizens Medal for her actions on Flight 247. The citation read, "For demonstrating that courage has no age limit and that a single voice raised in defense of human dignity can change the course of history." Mrs. Brooks stood at the podium in a lavender dress, her silver hair perfectly arranged, and she gave a speech that lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. It was the shortest speech of the ceremony. It was also the most memorable. "I did not do anything special," Mrs. Brooks said. "I saw something wrong, and I said so. That is all. But I have been alive long enough to know that most people do not say so. Most people look away. Most people tell themselves it is not their problem, and I understand why. Speaking up is hard. It is risky. It can cost you. But I want to tell you something that I have learned in 76 years of living. The cost of staying silent is higher.
It is always higher. Because when you stay silent, you give your consent. And when you give your consent, you become part of the problem. I did not want to be part of the problem anymore. So I spoke up. And I hope if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, you will speak up too. Thank you. The audience rose to their feet. The applause lasted for 2 full minutes. And Evelyn Brooks, the retired librarian from Palo Alto, walked off the stage with the quiet dignity of a woman who had done exactly what she believed was right and asked for nothing in return. Diane Whitmore's life had changed more than she could have imagined. She was still the vice president of operations at Global Atlantic Airways, but her job was different now. Not the title, the meaning. Before Flight 247, Diane had measured her success in metrics: on-time departures, revenue per available seat mile, customer satisfaction scores, contract values. She had been good at her job.
She had been one of the best in the industry, but she had been measuring the wrong things. She understood that now. The oversight committee that Julian Carter had demanded had been operational for 4 months. It was chaired by a former federal judge named Patricia Okonkwo, and it included Evelyn Brooks, 2 civil rights attorneys, a professor of organizational psychology from Stanford, and 3 former passengers who had filed discrimination complaints against Global Atlantic in previous years. The committee met every 2 weeks. It had full access to the airline's complaint records, training materials, and hiring data. It published a public report every 6 months. The first report had been released 2 weeks ago, and it had been brutal. Global Atlantic had made progress, the report acknowledged. But the progress was not enough. The culture was still broken. The training programs were still insufficient. The diversity of the leadership team was still inadequate.
The report gave the airline a grade of C+, not a failure, but not a passing grade either. Diane had read the report 3 times. She had highlighted passages. She had written notes in the margins. She had called a meeting with her entire leadership team and told them, in no uncertain terms, that a C+ was not acceptable, that they were going to do better, that they were going to earn an A. Not because Julian Carter was watching, not because the public was watching, but because it was the right thing to do. Because treating passengers with dignity was not a corporate initiative. It was a baseline requirement of being a decent human being. She thought about Julian Carter often. She thought about the 18 months she had spent trying to win his trust. She thought about how she had sent handwritten notes to his daughter on her birthday. She thought about how she had taken him to dinner and talked about her vision for Global Atlantic's future. She had genuinely believed she was building a relationship based on mutual respect. But she had also been hiding something. She had been hiding the discrimination complaints. She had been hiding the settlements. She had been hiding the fact that the airline she was asking him to invest in was systematically mistreating people who looked like him. And Julian had found out anyway. Because the truth always comes out. That was what Samuel Carter had told his son all those years ago at a gas station in Montgomery. The world has a way of revealing the truth. It takes time, but it always reveals the truth. Diane had not been fired. Julian had not asked for her resignation. He had told Richard Ashworth, in their conversation at the ferry building, that he did not believe in destroying people's lives. He believed in giving people the opportunity to change. And Diane was trying to change. Every day, every decision, every interaction. She was trying to become the person she had pretended to be during those 18 months of negotiations. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. But it was also the most necessary. Ava Carter was 13 years old now. She had grown 2 inches in the past 6 months. Her voice was changing. She had started reading books about astronomy and talking about becoming an astrophysicist. She was, in every way that mattered, her father's daughter. Smart, curious, quietly confident, and completely unintimidated by the world she was growing up in. 3 weeks ago, Ava's school had held a speech contest. The topic was, "What I Learned from My Parents." Ava had been one of 12 students who entered. She had written her speech over the course of a week, working on it at the kitchen table while her father made dinner. She had not shown it to him. She had wanted it to be a surprise. On the day of the contest, Julian sat in the front row of the school auditorium. He was wearing his gray hoodie. He had not planned to wear it. It was just the first thing he had grabbed when he was getting dressed that morning. But when Ava walked onto the stage and saw him sitting there, she smiled. She knew that hoodie. She knew what it meant. She knew that it was the hoodie he had been wearing on the flight that changed everything. Ava adjusted the microphone. She looked out at the audience, and then she began to speak. My father is not famous in the way most people think about fame. He does not appear on magazine covers. He does not post on social media. He does not go to parties or walk on red carpets. He goes to work and comes home and makes pasta with marinara sauce and helps me with my math homework. That is who my father is. But 6 months ago, something happened that made the world see what I have always seen. My father was on an airplane. He was sitting in first class, and a flight attendant told him he did not belong there. She told him to leave. She told him she could identify a valid first-class passenger, and she decided that my father was not one. Ava paused. The auditorium was silent. My father did not argue. He did not shout. He did not tell her who he was. He just stood up, picked up his backpack, and walked to a different seat. And I asked him later, when he got home, why he did not tell her, why he did not stop her, why he let her humiliate him. And my father looked at me and said something that I am going to remember for the rest of my life. He said, Ava, you should never have to tell someone who you are in order to be treated with dignity. You should be treated with dignity because you are a person. That is it. No other reason. Just that. She looked directly at her father in the front row. My father taught me that power is not about making people afraid of you. It is about knowing who you are and not letting anyone take that away from you. He taught me that patience is not weakness. It is strength under control.
He taught me that the world will judge you. It will judge you by your skin, by your clothes, by your accent, by 1,000 things that have nothing to do with who you really are, and you cannot stop that. But you can decide how you respond to it. You can decide to be patient. You can decide to wait. Because the truth always comes out. And when it does, you will not need to tell anyone who you are. They will already know. Ava stepped back from the microphone. There was a long moment of silence. Then the auditorium erupted in applause. Julian Carter, the man who had faced down a billion-dollar airline without flinching, sat in his seat and cried. He did not try to hide it. He did not wipe the tears away. He just sat there in his gray hoodie and let them fall. His daughter had understood. She had understood everything. Ava won the contest. 3 days after Ava's speech, Julian Carter drove to Meridian Cross, Alabama. It was a long drive.
12 hours from San Francisco to the small town where he had grown up. He drove through the flat farmland of the Central Valley, over the Tehachapi Pass, across the Mojave Desert, through Arizona and New Mexico and Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi, until finally he crossed the state line into Alabama. The landscape changed. The soil turned red. The pine trees grew thick on either side of the highway. And Julian felt something shift in his chest, the feeling of coming home. Meridian Cross looked mostly the same as it had when Julian left it at 18. The same main street, the same diner where his father used to take him for pancakes on Saturday mornings. The same high school where his mother had taught math for 32 years. The same church where he had been baptized when he was 2 weeks old. The same small houses with their wide porches and their carefully tended gardens. The same slow, quiet rhythm of a town that the world had mostly forgotten. But there was something new. Near the entrance to the town there was a sign. It had been put up by the town council 2 months ago. It said, "Welcome to Meridian Cross, proud hometown of Julian Carter." Julian had not asked for the sign. He had not known it was being put up until his cousin sent him a picture of it. He had felt a complicated mixture of emotions when he saw it. Pride, embarrassment, gratitude, and something else. Something that felt like the weight of all the people who had come before him, all the people who had worked and sacrificed and endured so that a boy from a small town in Alabama could grow up to do what he had done. He did not stop in town. He drove straight through, past the diner and the high school and the church, until he reached the Meridian Cross Cemetery. It was a small cemetery, tucked behind a grove of oak trees, with a wrought iron gate that creaked when you opened it. Julian parked his car on the gravel road and walked through the gate. He knew exactly where he was going. The headstone was simple, gray granite, clean lines. It read, Samuel James Carter, 1950 to 2019. Beloved husband, devoted father, he kept the faith. Julian stood in front of his father's grave for a long time. The sun was beginning to set. The light filtered through the oak trees, casting long shadows across the grass. A breeze stirred the leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a bird was singing. "Hey, Dad," Julian said quietly. His voice was rough. He had not spoken to anyone for the last 6 hours of the drive. He knelt down and placed a small object on the headstone. It was the Presidential Citizens Medal that had been awarded to Evelyn Brooks. She had given it to him after the ceremony. She had told him that it belonged to him as much as it belonged to her. Julian had tried to refuse. Mrs. Brooks had insisted. "You changed things, young man," she had said. "You changed things for a lot of people. This is yours, too."
Julian had not known what to do with the medal. He did not feel like he deserved it. He had not done what he did for recognition. He had done it because it was right. Because his father had taught him to be patient and to wait for the truth to reveal itself. But Mrs. Brooks had been insistent, and so Julian had taken the medal, and now he was giving it to his father. "You were right, Dad," Julian said. "The world has a way of revealing the truth. It took 39 years, but it did. And I want you to know that I remembered what you told me. Every time someone looked at me and decided they knew who I was without asking. Every time someone underestimated me. Every time someone told me I did not belong. I remembered your words. I remembered your hands on the steering wheel. I remembered the way you drove away from that gas station without saying a word. And I did what you said. I was patient. I waited. And the world revealed the truth." He paused. The breeze picked up. The oak trees rustled. "I brought someone with me, Dad. Well, not with me exactly. But I wanted to tell you about her. Her name is Ava. She is 13 now. She is smart. Smarter than me. She wants to be an astrophysicist. She gave a speech at her school last week. She talked about you. She did not know she was talking about you, but she was. She said that patience is not weakness. She said that you should never have to tell someone who you are in order to be treated with dignity. And I realized, listening to her, that you taught me those things. And I am teaching them to her. And she is going to teach them to her children someday. So you are still here, Dad. You are still teaching. You are still guiding. You just do not know it." Julian's voice broke. He stopped talking. He knelt there in the grass in front of his father's grave as the sun set over Meridian Cross, and the shadows grew long, and the first stars began to appear in the evening sky. He thought about everything that had happened in the past 6 months. The flight, the humiliation, the apology, the press conferences, the contract, the oversight committee, the changes at Global Atlantic, Monica Hayes and her letter, Evelyn Brooks and her medal, Ava and her speech. All of it. All of it had started with a single moment. A flight attendant looking at a man in a gray hoodie and deciding he did not belong. And all of it had led here. To a cemetery in Alabama. To a son kneeling at his father's grave. To a promise that had been made 32 years ago at a gas station in Montgomery, and that had finally been kept. "I kept the faith, Dad," Julian whispered. "I kept it." He stood up. He brushed the grass from his knees. He looked at the headstone one last time. Then he turned and walked back through the wrought iron gate, back to his car, back to the long road that would take him home to his daughter. The sun had set. The sky was deep purple, fading to black at the edges. The first stars were out. And somewhere, in the quiet of the Alabama evening, the spirit of Samuel Carter rested. Not because his son had become a billionaire, not because his son had been on the news, not because his son had brought a major airline to its knees, but because his son had remembered. His son had listened. His son had been patient. And the world, just as Samuel had promised, had revealed the truth. In San Francisco, Ava Carter was waiting for her father to come home. She had made dinner.
pasta with marinara sauce. The same recipe her grandmother had taught her father, the same recipe her father had taught her. She set the table for two. She lit a candle. She waited by the window. And when the headlights finally appeared in the driveway, she smiled. Because her father was home. And she knew, with the quiet certainty of a 13-year-old who had already learned the most important lesson life could teach, that everything was